hedgerows of Normandy, 1944. You are a grenadier, clutching the smooth wood of your Karabiner 98K. It's a masterpiece of engineering, the finest bolt-action rifle ever made. You peer through the leaves, spot a flicker of movement, and squeeze off a single, precise shot. The response is not one rifle, but a torrent. A storm of lead rips through the foliage, forcing you down. It's not a machine gun. It's something else, a sound you've never heard before. How can one American soldier fire so fast? This terrifying question, echoing in the minds of German soldiers from the dusty hills of North Africa to the dense forests of the Ardennes, marked a fundamental collision of two warring philosophies. It was a clash not just of armies, but of ideals, forged decades before the first shots of the Second World War were ever fired. On one side was the German doctrine, a direct descendant of Prussian military tradition. Its Mauser action was the global standard for bolt-action rifles, a mechanism so mechanically sound it was a work of industrial art. For the German infantryman, the firing process was a disciplined ritual. He would chamber a round from the 5-round internal magazine, take careful aim, squeeze the trigger, and then manually work the bolt, ejecting the spent casing and chambering the next cartridge. It was a deliberate, methodical rhythm. A skilled soldier could fire perhaps 15, maybe 20 aim shots in a minute. This was considered more than sufficient. German infantry tactics were built around the machine gun, the devastating MG-42. The riflemen were there to support it, to pick off targets of opportunity, and to maneuver while the machine gun laid down a base of fire. Ammunition was to be conserved. Every shot was meant to count. This was the proven way of war, the doctrine that had blitzed across Poland and France and carried the Wehrmacht to the gates of Moscow. On the other side of the Atlantic, a different lesson had been learned in the mud and blood of the Great War. American military planners saw the future of infantry combat not in the single, well-aimed shot, but in the overwhelming volume of fire. They understood that in the chaos of battle, suppression was as important as destruction. Pinning an enemy down, forcing them to keep their heads low, was the key to maneuver and victory. This wasn't a philosophy born from a long tradition of professional soldiery, but from the reality of a citizen army powered by the world's greatest industrial engine. The American vision was not to make every man a legendary marksman, but to give every man a weapon that would allow him to dominate the fire-swept space in front of him. This revolutionary concept led to a demand that no other army in the world was making in the 1930s. A standard-issue, semi-automatic rifle for every infantryman. The man who would answer this call was a quiet, Canadian-born designer at the Springfield Armory named John C. Garand. His creation, officially adopted by the U.S. Army in 1936 as U.S. Rifle, Caliber 30 M1, would fundamentally change the equation of infantry combat. Back in the Normandy hedgerow, the German grenadier does not understand these competing doctrines. He only understands the terrifying wall of lead that erupts from the American lines. The sound is not the steady, rhythmic crack of bolt-action rifles, but a relentless hammering barrage. It is the sound of an industrial revolution being unleashed upon a battlefield still tethered to the tactics of a bygone era. The weapon making that terrifying sound was a marvel of battlefield pragmatism. The M1 Garand was not elegant in the way a bespoke hunting rifle was. It was heavy, rugged, and built for one purpose, to generate an unrelenting volume of fire. Its secret lay in a gas-operated, rotating bolt system, When a soldier fired the M1, a small amount of the propellant gas from the burning powder was siphoned off through a tiny port in the barrel. This gas was channeled into a cylinder where it drove a piston, which in turn operated a long rod connected to the bolt. In a fraction of a second, this action unlocked the bolt, threw the spent cartridge casing out, cocked the hammer, and chambered a fresh round from the magazine. All of this happened with a single pull of the trigger. The soldier's only job was to aim and fire again. This semi-automatic capability fundamentally broke the rhythm of infantry combat that had existed for nearly a century. The German grenadiers' cadence of fire cycle aim-fire was replaced by the American GI's simple, devastating sequence of fire, fire, fire. To feed this revolutionary action, John Garand devised an equally innovative loading system, the 8-round en-bloc clip. Instead of feeding rounds into the rifle one by one, or from a stripper clip into an internal magazine, the American soldier took a pre-loaded steel clip containing 8 powerful 3006 Springfield cartridges and pushed the entire unit down into the rifle's open action. The bolt would slam shut, chambering the first round, and the rifle was ready. The numbers this system produced were staggering. An American rifleman could comfortably fire 40 to 50 aimed rounds per minute, more than double the sustained output of his German counterpart with the Kar 98K. A single American infantry squad could therefore generate a base of fire equivalent to a much larger German force, neutralizing enemy machine gun nests and dominating small unit engagements through sheer lead saturation. General George S. Patton would famously call it the greatest battle implement ever devised. For the American GI, the Garand inspired a profound sense of confidence. It was his shield and his sword, a tangible piece of American industrial power that gave him a decisive edge over his opponent. When the 8th and final round was fired, the now empty steel clip was automatically ejected with a distinctive metallic ping. That sound became one of the acoustic signatures of the Second World War. To American ears, it was a signal to reload, a momentary pause in their symphony of firepower. To German soldiers, huddled in their foxholes, that ping was a brief window of opportunity, a 2 or 3 second gasp for air before the storm of fire inevitably resumed. It was a fleeting, often fatal invitation to raise one's head. The first time German forces encountered the M1 in significant numbers was in the rugged terrain of North Africa during late 1942 and early 1943. The field reports sent back to German High Command were initially met with a degree of skepticism. They spoke of American riflemen who fought with the speed of submachine gunners, but with the range and power of a full-sized rifle. The anecdotal evidence was alarming, suggesting a tactical imbalance that the Wehrmacht's doctrine, with its emphasis on the MG42, was not fully equipped to counter. The individual German soldier was being systematically outgunned, and something had to be done. The legends from the battlefield would soon need to be verified by the scientist in the lab. By May of 1943, the whispers from the front lines had become a roar that could no longer be ignored. The anecdotes of impossible American firepower were no longer just soldiers' tales. They were a recurring theme in after-action reports and intelligence debriefs. For the German Army Weapons Agency, the Heereswaffenamt, the time for speculation was over. Crates containing captured American equipment began arriving at the sprawling Kummersdorf Proving Grounds, a top-secret facility south of Berlin. Here, in this sterile world of ballistics laboratories, firing ranges, and metallurgical workshops, the myths of the battlefield would be subjected to the cold, unforgiving logic of science. Amongst the captured machine guns, mortars, and bazookas was the primary object of their concern, the U.S. rifle, M1. To the German ordnance experts, men who had spent their lives perfecting the Mauser bolt action, the Garand was an object of intense professional curiosity. On the surface, it appeared somewhat crude compared to the finely machined Kar-98K. Its stock was thick, its action seemed complex, and its balance felt unfamiliar. But these were men who looked past aesthetics to the raw mechanics of a weapon. They disassembled the rifles with practiced hands, laying out each component on clean linen cloths. They marveled at the simplicity of John Garand's gas-operated system, the robust nature of the rotating bolt, and the sheer ingenuity of the en-bloc clip. It was a design philosophy that prioritized mass production and functional reliability over old-world craftsmanship. Then came the tests. The rifles were mounted in vices and fired for accuracy, their groupings measured at various ranges. They were fired rapidly to test for overheating and barrel wear. They were caked in mud, submerged in water, and packed with the fine sand that mimicked the conditions of the North African campaign where they were first encountered. Through it all, the M1 Garand performed with astonishing consistency. The German technicians, accustomed to the tight tolerances and occasional sensitivities of their own advanced weapons, were forced to acknowledge the rifle's incredible resilience. But the most damning confirmation of the frontline reports came during the rate-of-fire trials. A German expert, a master of the Kar-98K, was pitted against a captured M1. The German soldier worked his bolt with the fluid efficiency born of years of training, sending precisely aimed shots downrange at a respectable rate of nearly 20 rounds per minute. Then the M1 began to fire. The sound was a sharp, rapid succession of cracks, the rifle bucking in the shooter's hands but never ceasing its semi-automatic rhythm. 40, then 50 rounds a minute. The sheer disparity was laid bare in the stark mathematics of the firing range. The fast reloading system, the en-bloc clip, was also scrutinized. While the engineers noted the tactical disadvantage of the famous ping, which could signal an empty weapon, they could not deny the speed with which a soldier could bring the rifle back into action. The process of pressing a single, preloaded clip into the magazine was demonstrably faster and less fumble-prone in the heat of combat than feeding 5 individual rounds from a stripper clip into the Kar-98K. The final report from the Heereswaffenamt was a sober and chilling document for German High Command. It confirmed every fear. The Americans had armed their average infantryman with a standard-issue rifle that was mechanically reliable, powerful, and, most critically, possessed a rate of fire that was more than double that of its German counterpart. The conclusion was inescapable. Germany was facing a significant and potentially decisive technological deficit on the infantry battlefield. The individual German soldier, no matter how well-trained or courageous, was being fundamentally outgunned. The sobering conclusions reached in the sterile laboratories of Kummersdorf would soon be validated in the bloodiest laboratory of all, the Bocage country of Normandy. After the D-Day landings in June of 1944, as Allied forces pushed inland from the beaches, the war of maneuver gave way to a brutal, close-quarters slugging match. Here, the French countryside was a claustrophobic maze of small fields, sunken lanes, and ancient, towering hedgerows. These earthen walls, often 10 feet high and tangled with centuries of thick, gnarled vegetation, were a defender's dream and an attacker's nightmare. They broke the invasion force into small, isolated units and turned every field into a self-contained fortress. For the entrenched German defenders, often veterans of the Eastern Front, this terrain was ideal for their doctrine. A single, well-placed MG-42, camouflaged at the corner of a hedgerow, could command an entire field, its terrifying rate of fire capable of shredding any infantry caught in the open. The German riflemen, masters of fieldcraft, would dig in along the hedgerow, their Kar-98K rifles providing precise, supporting fire to pick off any American who dared to expose himself. It was a defensive system that, on paper, should have been nearly unbreakable. Into this lethal landscape came the American GI, and with him, the M1 Garand. The hedgerow war was not a war of long-range marksmanship. It was a series of savage, short-range ambushes, often fought at distances of less than 100 yards. In this environment, the German advantage in machine guns was often negated by the restricted fields of fire. The fight devolved into a contest between squads and platoons, and it was here that the Garand's firepower superiority became the decisive factor. An American squad, pinned down by an enemy machine gun, could unleash a volume of rifle fire that was simply impossible for the Germans to match. While a German squad had one primary source of automatic fire, the MG-42, an American squad had 12 individual sources of rapid, semi-automatic fire. The GIs would lay down a blistering barrage of .30-06 rounds, a tactic they called marching fire. They didn't need to see the enemy. They needed only to pour so much lead into the suspected German positions that no one could possibly return fire. This suppressive effect was overwhelming. The storm of bullets would rip through the dense foliage, thudding into the earthen banks of the hedgerows and kicking up dirt all around the German positions. Pinned down, unable to even peek over their cover without risking immediate death, the German machine gunner and his supporting riflemen were effectively neutralized. This was the critical window. Under the covering hail of Garand fire, other American elements, a bar gunner, a grenadier, or a soldier with a bazooka, could maneuver to a flank. They could crawl through a ditch or slip through a gap in the hedge to get a clear shot at the silenced German machine gun nest. The engagement would often end, not with a protracted firefight, but with a sudden, violent assault on a suppressed and disoriented enemy. The fighting in the bocage was a daily, brutal demonstration of the chasm that had opened between German doctrine and American industrial reality. The German soldier's courage and skill were undeniable, but he was fighting a new kind of war. His precision instrument, the Kar-98K, was simply no match for the sheer, relentless firepower of the M1 Garand in the close-in brawl of the Normandy hedgerows. The psychological impact of this firepower disparity was as profound as its tactical consequences. For the German Lanzer, the experience of being on the receiving end of the M1 Garand was deeply demoralizing. War is an assault on all senses, but the soundscape of the Normandy battlefield was uniquely terrifying. Veterans of the Eastern Front were accustomed to the ferocious but predictable crescendo of a Soviet human wave attack, announced by whistles and massed shouting. They understood the brutal agricultural sound of the Red Army's artillery. But the sound of an American rifle squad opening up was something alien. It wasn't the distinct, spaced-out crack of individual rifles they knew. It was a sustained, deafening roar, a seamless wall of noise and incoming lead that seemed to come from everywhere at once. This constant, suppressive fire frayed nerves and eroded confidence. A German soldier, armed with his Kar-98K, felt a growing sense of inadequacy. His training had taught him that a well-aimed shot was the pinnacle of soldiery. But the Americans seemed to be fighting with a different rule book, one written by the factory and not the drill sergeant. He would fire his single shot, then work his bolt, and in that 2-second interval, 3 or 4 American rounds would whistle past his position. It created a feeling of being perpetually behind, of being unable to gain fire superiority. This technological disadvantage fostered a creeping sense of being overwhelmed, not by a better soldier, but by a better equipped one. It fed into a narrative of helplessness against the vast, seemingly infinite resources of the United States. German soldiers began referring to the M1 with a mixture of respect and fear. They understood that every American infantryman they faced possessed a rifle that was, for all practical purposes, a class above their own. This wasn't a matter of opinion or propaganda. It was a hard truth learned in the most unforgiving of classrooms. Confidence in their own equipment, once a cornerstone of the German soldiers' fighting spirit, began to crack. If their standard-issue rifle was so clearly outmatched, what other deficiencies were they facing? This erosion of morale was a slow-acting poison. It didn't cause units to break and run in panic, but it created a pervasive, grinding sense of fatalism. The feeling grew that no amount of individual bravery or tactical ingenuity could ultimately overcome an enemy who could simply drown them in a tidal wave of steel. The leadership of the Wehrmacht was acutely aware of this problem. The reports from Kummersdorf were no longer theoretical documents. They were being confirmed every day by casualty lists from the front. The question was no longer whether a problem existed, but what, if anything, could be done about it. The German armaments industry, a juggernaut that had seemed unstoppable in 1940, was now groaning under the immense strain of a multi-front war. The demand for tanks, for aircraft, for U-boats, and for the voracious MG-42 was all-consuming. Resources were finite, and the Allied strategic bombing campaign was relentlessly squeezing the arteries of German production. To retool factories and divert precious steel and skilled labor towards mass-producing a brand-new semi-automatic rifle in the middle of this firestorm was a monumental undertaking. Germany did, in fact, have its own semi-automatic rifle program. The result was the Gewehr 43, or G43. Mechanically, it was a sound weapon, utilizing a gas system similar in principle to the Soviet SVT-40. It fed from a 10-round detachable box magazine, a feature considered by many to be superior to the Garand's en-bloc clip. It was accurate and well-liked by the troops who received it. The problem was not in its design, but in its production. It was Germany's industrial tragedy in miniature. The story of the Gewehr 43 is the story of a solution that was too little, too late. Its development was plagued by the competing priorities and internal rivalries that often characterized the Third Reich's armaments efforts. Early designs were overly complex and unreliable, but by the time a solid, functional weapon like the G43 was ready for mass production, the strategic landscape had shifted irrevocably. German industry, once the envy of the world, was being systematically dismantled from the air. Allied bombers pounded factories, railway hubs, and resource depots around the clock. The intricate web of suppliers and subcontractors needed to produce a sophisticated weapon, like the G43 was constantly being severed and rerouted. What could be achieved on a draftsman's board in Berlin was often impossible to implement on a factory floor in the Ruhr Valley. The result was a production run that could never hope to meet the staggering demand. While the United States, with its continent-sized industrial base untouched by war, was churning out M1 Garands by the millions at the Springfield Armory and other facilities, Germany struggled to produce the G43 in the thousands. By the end of the war, a little over 400,000 Gewehr 43s had been manufactured. This number, while respectable, pales in comparison to the well over 4 million M1 Garands produced during the same period. The disparity was not 10 to 1, it was an order of magnitude. This production failure meant that the G43 never became a standard issue weapon. It was distributed sparsely, often designated for squad marksmen or given to elite units on the eastern and western fronts. An entire German rifle company might be lucky to have a dozen G43s. The vast majority of German infantrymen, from the first day of the war to the last, would carry the trusted but outdated Karabiner 98K. The industrial failure was compounded by a logistical one. The German military's entire supply chain was built around the ammunition consumption rates of a bolt-action army. Soldiers were trained to conserve ammunition, and the logistical tail that supplied them was scaled accordingly. The sudden, widespread introduction of a semi-automatic rifle would have shattered this delicate system. An army equipped with millions of G43s would have required a colossal increase in the production and transportation of the 7.92 by 57 millimeter Mauser cartridge. The trucks, the trains, and the manpower to move that much ammunition simply did not exist. They had been consumed by the endless distances of the Russian steppe and the relentless attrition of a multi-front war. America, by contrast, had the luxury of building its logistical system from the ground up to support a semi-automatic army. The .3006 cartridge was produced in the billions, and the vast fleet of Liberty ships and Red Ball Express trucks existed to push that ammunition to the front lines. The M1 Garand was not just a rifle. It was the tip of a spear, and the shaft of that spear was a logistical and industrial colossus that Germany could no longer hope to match. This reality was a bitter pill for the German High Command. They had entered the war with what they believed was the world's premier military force, built on a foundation of superior training, doctrine, and technology. Now they found themselves locked in a conflict where the deciding factor was not the quality of the soldier, but the sheer productive capacity of the factory. The individual rifleman's duel was being lost on the assembly line. This growing realization of industrial and technological inferiority had a corrosive effect that spread far beyond the front lines. It reached into the highest echelons of the Wehrmacht, forcing a difficult reevaluation of the very principles upon which their army was built. The German military had long prided itself on a philosophy of qualitative superiority. They believed their tanks were better, their aircraft were more advanced, and their soldiers were more highly trained. In the early years of the war, this belief was largely justified. A Panzer IV was superior to a Polish 70P, a Messerschmitt 109 outclassed a British Hurricane, and the German doctrine of combined arms warfare, the Blitzkrieg, was decades ahead of its adversaries. The M1 Garand was one of the first unambiguous pieces of evidence that this era of qualitative advantage was over. It wasn't they produced. It was, in its own way, a perfect weapon, a finely tuned instrument for the skilled marksman. But the war had evolved beyond the need for millions of individual marksmen. It now demanded millions of riflemen who could dominate a fire sector. The Garand provided that capability. The Kar 98K did not. This fact was not lost on the German leadership. Captured M1 Garands were studied not just for their technical specifications, but for the doctrine they represented. This was the true source of Allied power. It wasn't just one rifle. It was the entire industrial and organizational machine that stood behind it. The German soldier's confidence in his personal weapon was a microcosm of a larger national loss of confidence. The early war years were fueled by a belief in German ingenuity and superiority. By 1944, that belief was being systematically dismantled. On the Eastern Front, they were being crushed by the sheer mass of Soviet T-34 tanks. In the skies over the Reich, they were being obliterated by armadas of American B-17 bombers. And on the battlefields of Western Europe, the humble infantryman was being outgunned by the M1 Garand. Each was a tangible, undeniable symbol of an enemy whose industrial might had surpassed their own. As the war ground towards its inevitable conclusion, the M1 Garand cemented its legacy not just as a tool of victory, but as a symbol of a paradigm shift in warfare. The conflict that began with Polish cavalry charging German panzers was ending with a clear vision of the future, a battlefield dominated by firepower, mobility, and the logistical capacity to sustain them. The Garand was the infantryman's entry into this new era. It fundamentally altered the dynamics of small unit tactics. For centuries, the basic building block of an infantry attack was the concept of fire and maneuver. One element would provide suppressive fire while another element moved to a more advantageous position. The M1 Garand blurred this line. A squad of GIs could effectively maneuver while still generating its own suppressive fire, a capability their opponents simply could not replicate. This allowed for more fluid, aggressive tactics and put relentless pressure on German defensive positions. The rifle's influence extended beyond the infantryman who carried it. It had a cascading effect on the entire battlefield. The ability of American rifle squads to independently suppress and neutralize German machine gun nests meant that supporting arms like mortars and artillery could focus on larger, more strategic targets. It freed up other assets and made the entire American combat system more efficient and lethal. The Wehrmacht, in a desperate attempt to counter this, was forced to push more and more automatic weapons to the front. They developed the Sturmgewehr 44, the world's first true assault rifle, a revolutionary weapon in its own right. But like the G43, it was a case of too little, too late. The STG-44 was a glimpse into the future of infantry weapons, but the M1 Garand was the weapon that dominated the present. In the post-war analysis, military thinkers around the globe took note. The age of the bolt-action rifle as the standard weapon of a major army was over. The future belonged to semi-automatic and fully automatic firearms. The M1 Garand had not just won battles, it had set the new standard. The Soviet Union would develop the SKS and then, most famously, the AK-47. The Belgians would create the FNFL, which would become known as the right arm of the free world. The Americans themselves would evolve the Garand's basic design into the M14 rifle. All of these post-war designs were a direct response to the lessons written in blood by the M1 on the battlefields of the Second World War. The story of the Garand versus the Kar-98K is therefore more than just a simple comparison of two pieces of military hardware. It is a parable of two nations, two industrial systems, and two philosophies of war. One was rooted in a proud, centuries-old military tradition that valued the expert craftsman and the master soldier. The other was born of a new world, a nation of factories and pragmatists who understood that modern war was ultimately an industrial equation. In this brutal arithmetic, the side that could put the most effective tools in the hands of the most soldiers would prevail. The German soldier was a superb fighter, steeped in a martial tradition that was second to none. His courage and tenacity, even in the face of overwhelming odds, are a matter of historical record. But in the hedgerows of Normandy, the forests of the Ardennes, and the final desperate battles inside Germany itself, he found himself facing an opponent armed with a rifle that fired faster, reloaded quicker, and ultimately embodied a more modern and sustainable way of waging war. Let us return one last time to that grenadier in the Normandy hedgerow. He is no longer just a soldier. He is a symbol of an entire military philosophy at the moment of its obsolescence. He lies pressed against the damp earth, the familiar weight of his Mauser in his hands, listening to the unfamiliar storm of semi-automatic fire tearing through the world around him. His rifle, a marvel of 19th century industrial precision, is an heirloom in a world that now demands disposable razors. Every careful, aimed shot he fires is answered by a volley. Every movement he makes is met with a torrent of suppression. He is not being outfought. He is being outproduced. The distinctive ping of an M1 clip ejecting offers a brief, tantalizing pause in the onslaught. Perhaps this is his chance. He raises his head for a fraction of a second, and in that moment he becomes a statistic, another victim of the firepower gap. The story of the M1 Garand is the story of how that gap was created and exploited. It is a testament to the vision of men like John Garand, who anticipated the needs of a future war, and to the industrial might of a nation that could turn that vision into a reality on a scale the world had never seen. It wasn't a perfect weapon. It was heavy. Its 8-round capacity was limited, and the inability to top off a partially spent clip was a genuine tactical drawback. But these were minor flaws in a design that was, at its core, fundamentally correct for its time. It delivered unprecedented power into the hands of the individual soldier, and in doing so, it changed the face of infantry combat forever. The legacy of the Garand is not just written in the pages of ordnance manuals or in the strategic histories of the Second World War. It is etched into the personal experiences of millions of GIs who carried it from the beaches of North Africa to the islands of the Pacific. For them, it was a constant, reliable companion, a tool that gave them the confidence to face a determined and skillful enemy. General Patton's famous declaration that it was the greatest battle implement ever devised was not hyperbole. It was the heartfelt endorsement of a commander who knew that the rifle his men carried gave them a crucial, life-saving edge. The M1 Garand was more than just a rifle. It was the sound of American industry, the rhythm of modern warfare, and for countless soldiers on the opposing side, the last sound they would ever hear.